Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination in the U.S. Introduction: a landmark legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 stands as one of the most pivotal pieces of legislation in American history, marking a monumental step toward achieving equality and justice for all people, regardless of race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on July 2, 1964, this groundbreaking law was the culmination of years of struggle by activists, leaders, and ordinary citizens who fought tirelessly against the pervasive system of racial segregation, discrimination, and inequality that had defined much of the nation's history, especially in the South. 1. The historical context: a nation divided. The legacy of segregation and discrimination. For much of American history, Black Americans and other minority groups faced institutionalized discrimination that affected nearly every aspect of their lives. From Jim Crow laws in the South that enforced racial segregation in public places, schools, and transportation, to discriminatory practices in employment and voting, Black Americans were systematically denied equal treatment under the law. Women, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other minority groups also faced discrimination, often excluded from opportunities and facing barriers to basic rights and freedoms. The Civil Rights Movement, a decade of struggle. By the early 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement had gained significant momentum. Inspired by the successes of earlier protests like the Montgomery bus boycott and the sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless others had begun to demand an end to segregation, disenfranchisement, and inequality. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, was a turning point that galvanized the nation's attention toward racial injustice and discrimination. The brutal treatment of peaceful protesters by local authorities, especially the violent response to the Birmingham campaign in Alabama, made it clear to many Americans that the status quo could no longer be tolerated. 2. The legislative battle: a long road to passage. President John F. Kennedy's role. The push for civil rights legislation began under President John F. Kennedy, who recognized the urgency of addressing racial inequality. After taking office in 1961, Kennedy proposed a civil rights bill aimed at ending segregation in public places, ensuring voting rights, and banning discrimination in employment. However, Kennedy's efforts faced fierce opposition, particularly from Southern lawmakers, and were stalled in Congress. Tragically, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, but his death turned his vision for civil rights into a powerful national cause. President Lyndon B. Johnson's leadership. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson took office and pledged to carry forward his predecessor's civil rights agenda. Johnson, who was known for his mastery of the legislative process, used his political influence to push for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Despite opposition from Southern Democrats and other segregationist forces, Johnson worked tirelessly to build support for the bill, arguing that it was not only a moral issue but also a political and economic necessity for the future of the nation. 3. The key provisions of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a sweeping piece of legislation that aimed to address the various forms of discrimination that existed in American society. Its key provisions included: Title I, Voting Rights. Title I banned literacy tests and other discriminatory practices used to prevent African Americans from voting. Although this provision was limited, it laid the groundwork for future voting rights protections, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Title II, Public Accommodations. Title II prohibited segregation in public accommodations, such as restaurants, hotels, theaters, and other places of public service. This was one of the most powerful aspects of the law, as it directly targeted the Jim Crow laws that had kept public spaces racially divided. Title III, Desegregation of Public Facilities. Title III authorized the Attorney General to file lawsuits to force the desegregation of public facilities and provide additional measures to ensure integration in schools and other public spaces. Title IV, School Desegregation. Title IV strengthened efforts to desegregate public schools by requiring federal funds to be withheld from districts that failed to comply with desegregation orders. It also authorized the U.S. Attorney General to intervene in cases of school desegregation. Title VI, federal funding. Title VI prohibited discrimination in federally funded programs and required any organization that received federal funding to take steps to eliminate discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Title VII, employment discrimination. Title VII prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, to enforce these provisions and ensure that employees had the right to sue employers for discriminatory practices. This section was one of the most transformative aspects of the Act, as it gave rise to major changes in workplace equality and helped to eliminate hiring biases. 4. The impact, a victory for civil rights. Overcoming resistance. The passage of the Civil Rights Act was a major victory, but it didn't come easily. The Southern Democrats and other segregationist lawmakers fought fiercely against the bill, filibustering in the Senate for over 80 days. However, Senator Hubert Humphrey, Senator Everett Dirksen, and others played crucial roles in overcoming these obstacles, and in June 1964, the bill passed the Senate with a 73-27 vote. A shifting landscape for racial equality. The passage of the Civil Rights Act marked a turning point in the struggle for racial equality in America. While it did not end all forms of discrimination, it was a critical first step in dismantling the legal framework of segregation and inequality. It paved the way for further civil rights advancements, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The broader civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also acted as a catalyst for broader social change. It galvanized other civil rights movements, including those advocating for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and the rights of other minority groups. It signaled that the fight for equality was no longer just a matter of the Black community, but a struggle for all marginalized people in the United States. 5. Legacy, a lasting impact on American society. A foundation for equality. The Civil Rights Act remains one of the most important pieces of legislation in U.S. history. It continues to serve as the cornerstone of the nation's commitment to equality and justice. The law established the principle that discrimination in public life, education, employment, and beyond is unlawful. It set a precedent for future legislation aimed at ensuring equal rights for all Americans. The ongoing struggle for equality. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark victory, the battle for full equality continues today. Issues such as racial profiling, economic inequality, voter suppression, and gender discrimination remain prevalent, and the law's fight for equality is ongoing. However, the Civil Rights Act serves as a reminder that progress is possible when people come together and demand justice for all. A new era for civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 forever changed the landscape of American society, creating a more just and equal nation. It broke down the legal barriers of segregation and discrimination, and its impact continues to reverberate across American society today. The act is a testament to the power of activism, the determination of those who fought for justice, and the enduring strength of the civil rights movement. Second wave feminism, 1960s, 1980s advocating for gender equality. Introduction. The emergence of a new feminist movement. The second wave feminism movement, spanning from the 1960s to the 1980s, marked a transformative period in the struggle for gender equality in the United States and around the world. Building on the foundational work of first-wave feminists, who focused primarily on legal rights like voting, second-wave feminists expanded their efforts to address a broader range of social, political, and economic issues related to gender. This wave was defined by its bold activism, challenging patriarchal norms, and a focus on social justice for women in all spheres of life. 1. The context, social and political changes of the 1960s. The legacy of first-wave feminism. first-wave feminism, which primarily took place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, had focused on legal rights, including securing suffrage, the right to vote, for women. By the time the 1960s arrived, many women's legal rights had been established, but social and cultural inequalities persisted. While women gained the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, their social roles and professional opportunities remained limited. Despite progress, women were still largely confined to domestic roles and were denied full access to education, healthcare, and career opportunities in many areas. Post-World War II and the rise of suburbia. After World War II, there was a societal push for women to return to domestic roles and away from the workforce. The post-war suburban ideal promoted the image of the happy housewife, leading to a feminine mystique, where women were expected to find fulfillment solely in their roles as wives and mothers. However, many women, especially those who had worked during the war, began to feel disillusioned by the narrow expectations placed upon them. As the civil rights movement and other social movements gained momentum, women began to recognize the need for their own organized push for equality. 2. Key issues and goals of second-wave feminism. Reproductive rights and birth control. One of the central issues that second-wave feminists addressed was reproductive rights. Women's access to contraception and the ability to make decisions about their own bodies became central to the movement. The approval of the birth control pill in 1960 was a major milestone, allowing women greater control over their reproductive choices. Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 Supreme Court decision, legalized abortion across the United States, marking a crucial victory for women's autonomy over their reproductive health. Workplace equality and equal pay. Another key issue for second-wave feminists was fighting for workplace equality. Women were often excluded from higher-paying jobs and were paid less than men for the same work. The movement called for equal pay for equal work, and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was one of the first pieces of federal legislation to address workplace discrimination on the basis of sex. Women fought for equal opportunities in fields traditionally dominated by men, such as law, medicine, and engineering, and called for greater representation in leadership roles. Challenging gender roles and stereotypes. Second-wave feminists also sought to dismantle rigid gender roles and stereotypes. Women were expected to marry, raise children, and focus on domestic duties, but many second-wave feminists sought to break free from these prescribed roles. The movement challenged the cultural ideal of the perfect housewife and advocated for the idea that women could be professionals, leaders, and activists. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, 1963, was crucial in exposing the dissatisfaction many women felt in the domestic sphere and became a rallying cry for women who wanted more from their lives. Legal equality and ending discrimination. Second-wave feminists demanded changes in laws that reinforced gender inequality. The Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, introduced in 1923, gained renewed momentum during the 1960s and 1970s. While it ultimately failed to be ratified, it became an important rallying cry for legal reforms. The movement also pushed for laws that would protect women from domestic violence and sexual harassment, issues that were previously ignored or downplayed by society and the legal system. 3. Influential figures and organizations. Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique. One of the most influential figures in second-wave feminism was Betty Friedan, whose book, The Feminine Mystique, examined the widespread dissatisfaction of suburban housewives and questioned the role of women in society. Friedan is credited with coining the term, the problem that has no name, to describe the deep sense of dissatisfaction experienced by women who were confined to domestic life. The book sparked widespread discussion and led to the formation of the National Organization for Women Now, in 1966, which aimed to advocate for gender equality in all areas of life. Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine. Gloria Steinem, one of the most recognizable figures of second-wave feminism, became a major voice in the movement through her writings and activism. Steinem co-founded the influential feminist magazine Ms. Magazine in 1972, which became a platform for feminist ideas and issues. Steinem's work helped shape the public's understanding of feminism, and she played a pivotal role in challenging the media's portrayal of women and advocating for the inclusion of women's voices in all aspects of society. Civil rights and intersectionality. While the movement largely focused on the experiences of white, middle-class women, the voices of black feminists and women of color became increasingly important in the 1970s. Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Angela Davis were key figures in pushing for an intersectional approach to feminism, which recognized that race, class, and sexuality intersected with gender oppression. Black women, in particular, highlighted that their struggles were often distinct from those of white women, as they faced both racial and gender discrimination. 4. Achievements and impact of second-wave feminism. Legal and legislative gains. Second-wave feminism achieved several major victories that reshaped American society. Title IX of the Education Amendments, 1972, banned sex discrimination in federally funded education programs, opening the door for greater opportunities for women in sports, education, and academia. The movement helped pass the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which aimed to eliminate gender-based wage disparities. The Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 protected a woman's right to choose an abortion, marking a significant victory for reproductive rights. Shifting cultural norms. Second-wave feminism fundamentally changed cultural attitudes about women's roles in society. Feminists argued that women could be both mothers and professionals, and they broke down traditional ideas of femininity. The feminist movement also played a key role in advocating for sexual liberation, challenging the societal taboos surrounding women's sexuality and promoting the idea of sexual equality and freedom. The legacy, building the foundation for future feminist movements. The second wave laid the foundation for future feminist movements, including third-wave feminism, which emerged in the 1990s and built upon the principles of intersectionality and global feminism. The feminist victories of the 1960s through the 1980s helped to dismantle many of the legal and social barriers that women faced, but the struggle for true equality continues today, as issues such as equal pay, reproductive rights, gender violence, and workplace discrimination persist. Second-wave feminism's enduring legacy. Second-wave feminism, from the 1960s to the 1980s, brought about profound changes in the fight for gender equality. It not only addressed key legal issues but also shifted societal attitudes about women's roles in the family, the workplace, and public life. While challenges remain, the second-wave movement forever altered the trajectory of feminist activism, empowering women to demand equal rights and opportunities and inspiring generations to continue the fight for justice and equality.